The fire was still burning when Elias Croft stepped through the door. Not embers. Not the slow orange collapse of a fire left to die on its own. A fire that had been fed, recently, deliberately, and was burning with the steady, purposeful heat of a home still occupied. The cast-iron pot above it held a stew that had not yet begun to thicken at the edges. The ladle rested across the rim, as if set down mid-stir. A half-eaten piece of cornbread sat on the table. Beside it, an overturned tin cup that had leaked its contents in a dark, spreading stain across the tablecloth. The Aldrich family had not left. There was no evidence of leaving. No coats removed from their pegs by the door. No boots missing from the row beneath the window. The dog had not barked when Elias walked the path to the porch, and now, standing inside the doorway, he understood why. The dog was curled beneath the table, sleeping. Everything was as it should have been. Everything was precisely, unbearably, wrong. Elias Croft stood in the middle of the Aldrich farmhouse for what he would later say felt like a very long time, listening to the fire, listening to the wind against the windows, listening to the absolute and total silence of a home from which 4 people had simply ceased to be. He called their names, once, then again, then a third time that came out quieter than the first 2, as though something in the room had pressed against his voice and kept it low. No one answered. The storm that struck Holt County in the first week of November, 1873, was not considered remarkable at the time. Missouri winters arrived without ceremony in those years. The hardwood forests of the Ozark Plateau shed their leaves early, and by October the hollows held a particular quality of cold that settlers described as wet and interior, as though the cold came from inside the hills rather than down from the sky. Storms swept through without warning. Families hunkered. Roads went soft. Neighbors did not see one another for days at a stretch, and this was ordinary. The storm that began on the evening of November 4th lasted approximately 36 hours. It brought sleet first, then heavy rain, then a driving wind from the northwest that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the oaks and left standing water in every low field from Mound City to the Missouri River. It was not the worst storm the county had seen that decade, nor the most damaging. When it passed on the morning of November 6th, it left behind the kind of cold, clarifying stillness that follows hard weather. A sky of pale, empty blue, a landscape scrubbed down to its bones. Elias Croft was 41 years old in 1873, and he had farmed the same parcel of land along Briar Creek for 19 of those years. His property abutted the Aldrich farm to the northeast, separated by a strip of timber and a stretch of rocky pasture that both families used for grazing in warm months. He knew the Aldrich land nearly as well as his own. He knew its fence lines, its drainage patterns, the way the south field flooded in wet years, and how Thomas Aldrich had been meaning to cut a ditch for the better part of a decade, without ever quite getting around to it. He knew the family, too. Thomas Aldrich was a few years older than Elias, quiet in the manner of men who work alone and do not feel the lack of company. His wife, Miriam, was known throughout the community as a capable and unsentimental woman who put up more preserves each autumn than any 2 other families combined and distributed them, with a generosity that seemed born less from warmth than from sheer practicality. She had more than she needed, and waste was its own kind of failure. They had 2 children, a boy named Joel, who would have been 12 or 13 that November, and a girl named Clara, who was 8. Elias had seen the Aldrich family on the Sunday before the storm. He had passed Thomas on the road between their properties, and they had exchanged the usual words: the coming weather, the condition of the road, a brief discussion of whether the creek was like to flood. Thomas had seemed no different than usual, quiet, self-contained, going about his day with the methodical unhurry of a man who had made his peace with the pace of things. That was the last time anyone who could later be confirmed as reliable reported seeing any member of the Aldrich family alive. When the storm cleared and the roads dried enough to travel, Elias waited another day. This was not unusual. A day's mud was a day's work lost, and his own property required attention after the storm. He mended a section of fence that had gone down in the northwest pasture. He checked his root cellar. He drained the standing water from around the base of the barn. On the morning of November 8th, 2 days after the storm ended, he walked the path through the timber to check on his neighbors. He would say later, in the statement he gave to the county sheriff and again to the circuit judge who convened a brief inquiry in December, and again in various retellings over the following years, that he had not been alarmed as he walked. There was no premonition. The morning was cold and bright and ordinary. A pair of crows moved in the high, bare branches of the oaks along the path. A thin skim of frost still held in the shadows beneath the trees where the sun had not yet reached. He noticed the smoke first. It rose from the chimney of the Aldrich farmhouse in the way that smoke rises from a well-tended fire, steadily, thickly, moving straight up in the windless morning air, before bending gradually to the north. This was, in itself, not remarkable. What made Elias pause at the edge of the timber was the degree of it. The smoke was more than a banked fire produces overnight, more than a fire newly built to take the morning chill off a cold room. It was the smoke of a fire that had been attended recently and was burning well. He crossed the pasture and came to the yard. The yard was undisturbed. No unusual tracks in the frost-softened ground, though he would later admit he had not looked carefully at that point. The gate to the kitchen garden stood as it always did, latched but not locked. The barn door was closed. The chickens were in their yard. Everything had the aspect of a farm beginning its morning. He went to the door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again, then tried the door. It opened without resistance. The fire was burning. The stew was warm. The ladle rested across the pot. The cornbread sat on the table beside the tipped cup. The dog slept beneath the table. Elias Croft stood in the doorway and called for Thomas Aldrich. He called for Miriam. He called for Joel. He called for Clara, whose name, when he said it into the empty kitchen, seemed to dissipate almost immediately, as though the air of the room absorbed it before it could travel any distance. He went through the house. It was a modest structure by the standards of the time. A main room serving as kitchen and sitting area, 2 sleeping rooms separated by a board partition, a small alcove at the back that Thomas had added some years earlier and used for storage. The house contained 4 beds, all of them made. Not made in the way of beds made hurriedly, sheets thrown roughly into place before departure. Made carefully, pillows set straight, quilts smoothed and tucked. The children's room held the particular orderliness of a space tidied by adult hands. Toys arranged, a small slate and chalk set neatly on the window ledge, a rag doll placed upright against the pillow of the smaller bed. On the table in the main room, beside the tipped cup and the half-eaten cornbread, there were 4 breakfast settings. 3 of the plates were empty. One, the smallest, set at the place where a child would sit, held a portion of food that had been started but not finished. A few bites taken, a few left, the fork placed across the plate at an angle that suggested it had been set down mid-meal, not cleared. The fire burned, the dog slept. Elias stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Then he went back outside. He checked the barn next. The animals were in their stalls, 2 draft horses, a milk cow, and the small herd of pigs in the pen adjoining the south wall. All present, all fed, all watered within the past day or two by Elias's estimation. The horses were calm. The cow had been milked within the last day, or her discomfort would have been evident, and it was not. The pigs had fresh slop in their trough. He came back out and stood in the yard and looked at the farm in its entirety. The woodpile beside the porch held a good quantity of split wood, and beside it, on the chopping block, sat a wedge and a maul, positioned as though their user had stepped away for a moment and intended to return. 3 pieces of split wood lay on the ground around the block, not yet stacked. A 4th piece sat on the block itself, partly split, the wedge lodged in its grain. The kitchen garden, still holding a few late root vegetables under the protection of heavy mulch, had not been disturbed. The compost pile at the garden's edge was undisturbed. The outhouse door was ajar. Elias walked the property in an expanding circle, going slowly, watching the ground. The frost had not been heavy enough to preserve clear tracks, but the ground near the house was soft from the recent rain, and in soft ground there are always impressions. He found the usual traces of daily movement: the path from the house to the barn, the path to the woodpile, the path to the kitchen garden. These impressions were of varying age, some fresher than others, none of them suggesting anything beyond the ordinary traffic of a farm family going about its work. What he did not find was evidence of departure. He circled the house twice. He walked the fence line along the road. He went to the gate that opened onto the main path, the path he himself had used to approach, and crouched down and looked at the ground carefully. There were tracks in the soft earth at the gate. One set, going inward, his own, from perhaps 20 minutes before. He would note this later, carefully and somewhat haltingly, in his statement to the sheriff. He was a practical man, and he knew the limits of reading ground. Frost could obscure, rain could soften and smooth, wind could move loose surface soil. He was not claiming certainty. He was only saying what he observed. He went back to the house. The fire was still burning. He sat in one of the chairs at the kitchen table, Thomas Aldrich's chair, the one with the slightly uneven leg that always gave a faint creak when it moved. And he sat there for a while, not thinking in any organized way, simply present in the strange, ordinary quiet of the house. The dog had not yet woken. The stew continued to send up its thin thread of steam. On the shelf above the fireplace, between a tin of tobacco and a small hand mirror, sat a daguerreotype in a wooden frame. Elias had seen it before on previous visits. It showed the Aldrich family at what appeared to be a fair or a public gathering. Thomas standing behind Miriam, who sat with Clara in her lap. Joel stood at his father's side, very straight, with the slightly rigid expression of a boy trying to appear older than he was. It was not a remarkable photograph. Families had such photographs. He did not know why he looked at it for as long as he did. He left the house, closed the door behind him, and walked to the nearest neighboring farm, the Beecham property 3/4 of a mile to the south, to tell them what he had found. By midday, there were 8 men at the Aldrich farm. Silas Beecham had come immediately upon hearing Elias's account, and he had brought his 2 eldest sons. Word had traveled to 2 other farms by early afternoon, and 3 more men had arrived before sunset. The county sheriff, a man named Abel Hurst, was summoned by a rider sent to the county seat, but he would not arrive until the following day. The men searched. They covered the timber between the Aldrich property and the road in a rough line, moving slowly, calling names. They searched the creek bank, the low fields, the brush along the fence lines, but One of the Beecham boys climbed to the top of the highest hill on the property and looked out in every direction with a set of field glasses borrowed from his father. They found nothing. No bodies. No evidence of injury. No blood anywhere on the property, inside or outside the house. No sign of violence, struggle, or forced entry. The house had not been disturbed by any hand but its own inhabitants. Every item was in its place, or very nearly so. The family Bible on its shelf. The winter clothes hung in the sleeping rooms. The boots in their row beneath the window. The boots, Elias pointed this out, to Silas Beecham that afternoon. 4 pairs of boots in their row beneath the front window. 1 large pair for Thomas. A smaller pair, Miriam's. 2 children's pairs, the boy's with a small repair to the left sole that Elias had seen Miriam stitching one evening when he had come to return a borrowed tool. All 4 pairs were there, in November, in Missouri, after a storm. The men discussed this. Several explanations were offered. That the family might own other footwear not kept in that row. That perhaps they had been wearing shoes rather than boots. That perhaps they had gone somewhere in a wagon and worn lighter footwear for traveling. There was no wagon on the property. There were no horses missing. One of the Beecham boys went back to the barn to check again and reported that both horses were in their stalls. The men stood in the yard as the light began to go thin and gray in the west, and they talked in the way that men talk when the facts they have assembled do not cohere into anything recognizable. Several theories were advanced. A sudden family emergency might have drawn them away on foot. But to where, and in what direction? They might have gone to a neighbor's for help. But which neighbor, and why had no one seen them? The storm might have caused some accident or displacement, but the storm had been over for 2 days. Elias said very little during these conversations. He had said what he had to say. He had described the fire, the stew, the sleeping dog, the boots. He had described the state of the yard and the absence of outward tracks at the gate. He had described the daguerreotype on the shelf and then stopped himself because he did not know why he was describing it, and it did not seem relevant. The men set a watch that night. 2 of them stayed in the house, not in the family's rooms, but in chairs in the main room, while the others went home to their own families. The fire was kept burning. The dog, which had finally woken and accepted a handful of food from Silas Beecham without particular interest, was left inside. In the morning, the 2 men who had kept watch reported nothing unusual. The fire had burned low, but not out, requiring attention once in the night. The dog had slept. The house had been quiet. They had heard nothing. They had seen nothing. The stew in the pot had been consumed at some point during the evening, not by the men, who said they had not touched it, and both of them, questioned separately by Sheriff Hurst when he arrived the following morning, offered the dog as the most likely explanation, though neither of them had seen the dog move from its place beneath the table. Abel Hurst was a careful man. He had been sheriff of Holt County for 7 years, and before that had served as a deputy in 2 other Missouri counties, and in that time he had dealt with disappearances before. Not many, but enough to have developed a set of working assumptions about how people went missing. They went missing, in his experience, for one of several reasons: accident, violence, or intention. Accident meant a fall, a drowning, a mishap with equipment or animals. Violence meant another person. Intention meant they had chosen to go, and had done so with deliberate concealment. He spent most of his first day at the Aldrich farm considering intention. It was not an unreasonable consideration. Families left sometimes. It happened. Debt, trouble with neighbors, a situation at home that had grown intolerable. A man might choose to take his family and go, and he might choose to do so in a way that made it difficult to follow. The apparent normality of the house, the fire, the meal, could be read as staging. Create the impression of interrupted routine. Make it look like the moment before, rather than the moment of, but the boots and the horses. Hurst walked the property as Elias had, looking at the ground. He spent a long time at the gate. He walked the road in both directions, going perhaps a quarter-mile each way, crouching periodically to examine the soft shoulder of the road. He found nothing he could say, with confidence, was connected to the Aldrich family. He interviewed everyone who had been at the property since Elias's initial discovery. He interviewed the neighbors who lived within a mile or two of the Aldrich farm. He sent riders to the nearest towns, Mound City, Oregon, Bigelow, with descriptions of the family. No one had seen them. He established, as best he could, a narrow window for the disappearance. Thomas Aldrich had been seen on Sunday, November 2nd. The storm had begun on the evening of November 4th. Elias Croft had found the farm on the morning of November 8th. Somewhere within that window, most likely, given the evidence of the kitchen, within a much narrower portion of it, the family had ceased to be present on their own land. The evidence of the kitchen, Hurst noted in his report, suggested the morning of November 7th or November 8th, based on the state of the fire and the freshness of the food. The stew in the pot had been prepared within 24 hours of discovery. The cornbread was not stale. The fire had not been maintained overnight, but had been built up or built afresh, not long before Elias arrived. This meant the disappearance had occurred that morning. November 8th, perhaps an hour or two before Elias Croft's arrival, or, and Hurst included this possibility in his notes without further elaboration, the fire had been built and the food prepared after the family was gone. He did not speculate further on what that might mean. He was a practical man. He remained at the farm for 3 days. His official report, submitted to the county court in late November, recorded the following conclusions. The Aldrich family: Thomas, age approximately 44, Miriam, age approximately 38, Joel, age 13, and Clara, age 8, had not been located, and their whereabouts were unknown. There was no evidence of foul play. There was no evidence of voluntary departure. The animals and property were intact. The circumstances of the disappearance were, in the sheriff's words, without satisfactory explanation at this time. The farm was put in the care of Elias Croft by informal arrangement while the court determined how to proceed. Elias fed the animals. He maintained the property. He went to the house each morning and each evening. He kept the fire burning. He did not speak of this to many people, and when he did speak of it, he did so carefully and without embellishment, aware of how it would be received. The dog. The dog was a large, mixed-breed animal, of a kind common to working farms, neither handsome nor otherwise, useful for keeping vermin from the grain stores and for alerting the household to the approach of strangers. It had no name that Elias knew of, or if it had one, he had never heard it used. Thomas Aldrich was not a man who named his animals. The dog did not leave the house. In the days after the disappearance, while Elias maintained the property, the dog remained inside. It ate when food was brought to it. It drank when water was placed nearby. It did not, as far as Elias could observe, ever move of its own apparent will from the main room. It slept beneath the table where it had been sleeping when Elias first arrived, or in the vicinity of that spot. When Elias came in the mornings, it was there. When he came in, the evenings, it was there. On his 6th visit to the property, Elias noted that the dog appeared to be watching something. He would have difficulty describing this later, not watching in the alert, focused way of a dog that has heard a sound or detected a smell. Ears up, body tense, attention pointed in a specific direction. This was different. The dog sat at the near end of the table, facing the wall opposite the fireplace, with the particular quality of stillness that is not rest but attendance. The way, Elias would say, that a person sits when they are listening to someone speak, following the sound of a voice from one side of a room to the other. There was no one in the room. Elias stood in the doorway and watched the dog for a while. The dog did not acknowledge him. Its gaze moved, slowly, slightly, as though tracking something at a walking pace, from one end of the wall to a point nearer the window, and stopped there. Elias looked at the wall. He looked at the window. He looked back at the dog. He went about his work. He mentioned this to Silas Beecham in passing, framing it as an oddity rather than anything of significance. Beecham was a practical man and offered practical explanations. The dog was grieving. The dog was waiting for the family to return. Animals were sensitive to change and expressed it in ways that human observers sometimes misread. Elias agreed that this was likely so. He went back the next morning. The dog was in the same position, watching the same wall. Elias built the fire up and sat in Thomas Aldrich's chair and watched the dog for a long time. The fire made its sounds. The frost outside softened as the morning advanced. The dog sat motionless, its attention fixed on the empty wall, and Elias sat in the chair with his hands rested on his knees and watched and did not understand what he was seeing and did not try to make it into something he understood. After a while, he became aware of something that he could not precisely name. The room had a quality to it that he could not account for. He was not a man given to fanciful perception, and he resisted, then and in subsequent retellings, the temptation to describe it in dramatic terms. It was not an oppressive quality. It was not threatening. It was the quality, he would eventually say, of a room in which people had very recently been. The particular warmth of occupied space, the residual sense of presence that a room retains for a short time after its inhabitants have gone out for a moment, before the air settles and the temperature equalizes and the space returns to its neutral state. The room felt as though someone had just left it. Not long ago, a few minutes perhaps, and he did not like this formulation, and did not offer it until he had been pressed on several occasions, not as though someone had just left, but as though someone had not yet quite gone. He did not sleep well that November. The county court appointed a guardian for the Aldrich property in early December, confirming the informal arrangement with Elias and establishing a legal record of the farm's caretaker status. A formal search had been conducted in late November, organized by the sheriff with assistance from a group of volunteers, perhaps 30 men in total, who had covered the surrounding countryside in a radius of several miles. They had searched the creek, the river access, the abandoned farmsteads in the area, the timber. They had found nothing. The farms nearest to the northwest, a property belonging to a family named Garrett who had arrived in the county only 2 years prior, reported something during the organized search that was included in the sheriff's supplementary notes and then not much discussed afterward. One of the Garrett sons, a young man of perhaps 17 or 18, had been helping with the search in the timber north of the Aldrich property. He told the search party leader that on the morning of November 7th, the day after the storm ended, he had been in that timber checking on a trap line he ran for small game. He had heard, or thought he had heard, the sound of a family traveling through the woods, the particular sound of multiple people moving through brush, the rustling and branch cracking of a group rather than a single person, the occasional sound of what might have been a child's voice. He had not investigated. He had assumed it was neighbors, people from a nearby property perhaps, checking damage from the storm. He had gone about his business. When pressed on what direction the sounds had come from and what direction they seemed to be moving, he described a line that would have taken them away from the Aldrich farm, north into the deeper timber, rather than toward any road or settlement. It was November. The storm had just passed. The temperature in the timber that morning, he recalled, had been extremely cold. He had not thought it odd at the time. He thought it odd now. The sheriff noted this testimony and included it without comment. Elias read the supplementary report when it was shared with him. He sat with it for a long time. The Garrett timber, the strip of old growth to the north of the Aldrich property, was dense and largely inaccessible to horses or wheeled vehicles, traversable only on foot and with some difficulty even then. There was nothing in that direction for several miles. No settlement, no road, no farmstead, only hills and timber and the seasonal creek that ran through the lowest part of the hollow. He thought about the boots. 4 pairs of boots in their row beneath the window. He thought about the fire on the morning of November 8th, burning steadily, recently fed. He thought about the stew in the pot, prepared within 24 hours of his arrival. He tried to reconcile these things with the sound of a family moving through the timber north of the property on the morning of November 7th, in temperatures well below comfort, without coats and without boots, in a direction that led to nothing. He could not. He mentioned this to his wife that evening. She was quiet for a moment, and then said that some things did not have the kind of answer that a person could sit with, and that the best a person could do was to go about their life and trust that the world held reasons even when those reasons were not given to you. He thought this was probably wise. He went back to the Aldrich farm in the morning. The winter was hard that year, and the farm required more maintenance than Elias had anticipated. He found himself spending more time on the property than was strictly necessary, more than the animals required, more than the structure demanded. He had begun, without quite deciding to sit in the house in the evenings. He would tell himself he was checking the fire, or checking the animals, or attending to some small repair. He would go inside, and he would sit in Thomas Aldrich's chair, and the evenings would pass. The dog remained. By February it had developed a routine that Elias had come to observe with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to note things without drawing conclusions from them. In the mornings the dog was always beneath the table, sleeping or resting. In the late afternoons it moved to the position by the wall, that watchful, attending posture, and it held this until dark, or until the fire burned low and the room went cold. Elias had begun to notice that the dog's gaze in those afternoon hours was not fixed on a single point. It moved, slowly, subtly, in a way he might have attributed to restlessness or distraction if the movement had been less regular. But it was regular. It followed a pattern that he could only describe, when he allowed himself to describe it, as the pattern of people moving through a room. The measured pace of walking, the pause at certain points, the resumption. He said nothing about this to anyone for a while. In February he mentioned it to the circuit preacher, who visited the county every 6 weeks and with whom Elias had a long-standing and not entirely comfortable relationship. Now, the preacher was a younger man than Elias, earnest and somewhat literal in his faith, and Elias had always found his certainties faintly grating. But he was the only person Elias knew who might be expected to have a framework for what Elias was trying to describe. The preacher listened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Elias had not expected, and that stayed with him. He said, "Sometimes a place holds something that has not finished." He did not elaborate on what this meant theologically or practically. He did not offer comfort or advice. He simply said it, and then moved the conversation on to other things. Elias sat with this for a long time. He sat with it in Thomas Aldrich's chair in the evenings, watching the dog watch the room. In the spring of 1874, when the snow came off the hills and the creek levels dropped, a man named Donovan, who worked timber for a company operating in the area, came to Elias with something he had found in the deep woods to the north of the Aldrich property. He had found a place. He described it with some difficulty. A clearing, or a space that functioned as a clearing, though the trees surrounding it were ancient and dense and had not been cut. The ground in this space was different from the ground around it. He was not sure in what way, only that it was different. Harder, drier. The forest floor in that part of the timber held moisture from the snowmelt and was soft underfoot. But this space was not soft. It was, he said, almost warm. In early March in the North Timber, the ground had been warm underfoot. There was nothing in the space, no physical evidence of habitation or passage, no clothing, no personal effects, no bones, nothing that would constitute evidence of anything, he said. But that was the point he was trying to make. There was nothing, and there should not have been nothing, because the nothing was a specific kind of nothing that felt deliberate. He had stood there for some time, he said, and he had felt, very clearly and without ambiguity, that the space had been recently occupied, not by an animal, by people. Elias went with him to the place. He stood in it. He looked at the trees around it, and at the ground beneath his feet, and at the sky above, visible through the high canopy as a pale, ordinary March sky. He stood there for a long time. He would say, later, that he did not feel what the timberman had described. No sense of warmth, no particular quality to the air or the ground. He would say he felt nothing unusual. He would also say that when he turned to leave, he stood for a moment facing back into the clearing, and that for a brief, very ordinary-seeming moment, he had the strong and clear impression that there was someone standing at the far edge of it, not a threatening presence, not a disturbing one, simply a presence, the neutral, unremarkable sense of another person in the vicinity. When he looked directly at the far edge of the clearing, there was nothing there. He went home. He did not sleep well that night. The Aldrich farm was eventually sold. The court proceedings took the better part of 3 years, during which time no member of the Aldrich family was located, or any evidence of their fate discovered. In 1876, the property was transferred to a family named Coulter from St. Joseph, who had no knowledge of its history and who worked it without notable incident for several years. The Coulter family left in 1882. They left, by all accounts, without any specific incident to point to. The husband told people at the time that the farm had not suited them, that the land was harder than expected, the winters more isolated, the property more demanding than its size would suggest. These were not unreasonable explanations. Farming in that part of Missouri was always hard. His wife, in a letter to her sister that survived in a family archive and was not widely known until decades later, offered a different account. She wrote that she had been unable to sleep in the house from the second month onward. Not from fear, she was careful to say. She was not afraid. She simply could not sleep, because the house, even in its deep night quiet, did not feel empty. It felt, she wrote, like a house in the middle of a day, occupied, in motion, attended. The kind of feeling that kept her from resting, because some part of her kept expecting someone to come through the door. No one ever came through the door. she asked her husband to move them, and eventually he agreed. The farm changed hands twice more before the end of the century. Elias Croft lived on his own property until his death in 1891. He continued until he grew too old for the walk to visit the Aldrich farm, on occasion, not when it was occupied by the subsequent families, but during the intervals when it sat empty between tenants, which seemed to occur more frequently than was typical for good farmland in a settled county. His son, who took over the Croft property after his father's death, reported that Elias had spoken of the Aldrich farm throughout the last years of his life. Not obsessively, not in a way that suggested distress, but with a regularity that his son noticed and later remembered as slightly unusual for a man who was otherwise not given to dwelling on things. He spoke of it, the son said, the way you speak of an unfinished piece of work, something you left in the middle of, that you keep thinking you'll get back to, though you never quite do. What his father had left unfinished at the Aldrich farm, the son could not say. He had asked once, and his father had been quiet for a moment, and then said that it was not his to finish, that he did not know whose it was. The dog, the Aldrich dog, had remained on the property for slightly over a year after the family's disappearance. Elias had fed it throughout that time. In December of 1874, it was gone when he arrived one morning. The door was closed. There was no way it could have left without the door being opened. He looked for it. He did not find it. In the 1930s, a man named Garrett, a grandson of the family who had owned the property to the northwest of the Aldrich farm, gave an interview to a local history project being conducted by a teacher at the county school. He was in his 60s by that time, and he had grown up in the county hearing the story of the Aldrich family. His grandfather, he said, had told him something that had not appeared in any official record and that the family had never much discussed. On the morning of November 8th, 1873, the same morning that Elias Croft had walked to the Aldrich farm and found the fire burning and the family gone, his grandfather had been outside in the pre-dawn dark, tending to something with the animals. It was very early. The sky had not yet lightened. He had seen a light at the Aldrich farm, not the light of fire from the chimney or the window, though there was that too, he said. A different light. A light in the yard, or near the yard, that was not a lantern and not a torch, and not anything he could account for. It was, his grandfather had said, like light from a lamp carried by someone walking, the particular moving, shifting quality of a carried lamp. But there was no lamp. There was only the light moving across the yard and toward the timber, and then gradually, not moving anymore. His grandfather had not gone to investigate. He had not known there was anything to investigate. He had thought nothing of it until weeks later, when the news had settled in, and he had understood the timing. He had never told anyone. He did not know what there was to tell. The interview was preserved in a folder of local history documents that sat in the county library for several decades. It was not widely read. A researcher who examined it in the 1970s noted it briefly in a study of Ozark folklore and disappeared events, categorizing it under anomalous light phenomena and moving on. The Aldrich farm today is a cattle pasture. The house has been gone for many decades, taken down at some point in the early part of the last century, for reasons not recorded. The foundation stones remain, low and moss-covered, and the old root cellar opening is still visible if you know where to look. The timber to the north is still there. People who walk it, which is not many, occasionally report the same thing the timberman Donovan reported in the spring of 1874, a place in the deep woods where the ground is different. Not wrong, exactly. Not frightening. only different in a way that resists easy description, a warmth out of season, a quality of dryness and wet ground, the particular sense of a space that is or has recently been, or perhaps perpetually is, inhabited. No one has ever found evidence of who inhabits it. No one has ever found the Aldrich family. The record simply ends. 4 people in a house with the fire burning, and the meal prepared, and the boots in their row. And then, by some means that leaves no trace in any direction, they are elsewhere. Whether elsewhere is a place that can be named, or measured, or returned from, the record does not say. Some things remain open. That is, in the end, perhaps the only honest thing to say about them.